The sound of breaking glass echoed through Xavier Anderson's penthouse as he hurled the framed photograph against the wall, watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces, much like his heart had 3 years ago. He stood in the center of his immaculate living room, breathing heavily, tie loosened, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his fingers through it too many times. "Sir, is everything all right?" His housekeeper, Mrs. Patel, called from the hallway, her voice tinged with concern. "Everything's fine. I'll clean it up," Xavier replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "You can go home early today." As Mrs. Patel's footsteps retreated, Xavier crouched down to pick up the broken frame. The photograph showed a younger version of himself, smiling broadly next to Olivia, the woman who had taken his trust, his love, and his belief in happily ever afters, then crushed them all with a single betrayal. Today marked exactly 3 years since he'd discovered her affair with his former business partner. 3 years since he'd realized that even with all his wealth, the billions he'd accumulated through Anderson Technologies, he couldn't buy loyalty or genuine love. "Never again," he muttered, sweeping the glass shards into a dustpan. "Love isn't worth the risk." At 34, Xavier had rebuilt his life around his work. His company now dominated the tech industry, and he had just closed a deal that would add another $500 million to his already substantial fortune. He had everything money could buy: the penthouse with its panoramic view of New York City, a fleet of luxury cars, vacation properties on 3 continents. Everything except someone to share it with, and that was by design. His phone buzzed, displaying his assistant's name. "What is it, Kyle?" Xavier answered sharply. "Mr. Anderson, just a reminder about tomorrow's charity gala. The foundation is expecting you at 7. Xavier sighed. He had almost forgotten about the Children's Future Foundation Gala, an annual event he'd committed 2 years ago. "Right. Have the car ready at 6:30. "Will do. And, sir, the PR team suggests you bring a date. It would help with your image after the Weston media coverage last month." Xavier grimaced. The business magazine had recently profiled him as the Ice King of Tech, a brilliant but cold-hearted CEO who had abandoned any semblance of a personal life. "I don't need a date. I'll see you tomorrow," he said, ending the call before Kyle could argue. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle below. Tomorrow was just another business obligation, another chance to network and maintain appearances. Love, relationships, connections, those were luxuries he'd decided he couldn't afford. The next morning, Xavier woke at precisely 5 a.m., as he did every day. His morning routine was a well-choreographed dance, a punishing hour-long workout in his private gym, followed by a protein shake and a cold shower. By 7 a.m., he was seated at his desk in the home office, reviewing quarterly reports while the city below was just beginning to wake. His phone rang, interrupting his concentration. "Xavier speaking." "Zav, it's James. Did you see the Morgan proposal?" his CFO asked. "Just finishing it now. The numbers don't add up in Section 4. Have the team rework it before our meeting." "Already on it. Hey, are you bringing anyone to the gala tonight?" Xavier pinched the bridge of his nose. "Not you too. Why is everyone so concerned about my dating life?" James chuckled on the other end of the line. "Because you don't have one. Look, I'm just saying, even sharks stop swimming sometimes." "Only when they're dead," Xavier replied dryly. "I'll see you at the office." 2 hours later, Xavier strode through the glass doors of Anderson Technologies' headquarters, a 60-story monument to his success in Midtown Manhattan. Employees straightened as he passed, offering polite nods that he returned with brisk acknowledgments. "Morning, Mr. Anderson," his executive assistant Kyle said, falling into step beside him with a tablet in hand. "Your 10 a.m. with the development team is set. The Tokyo office reported successful testing on the new security protocol, and your suit for tonight has been delivered to your office." "Thanks, Kyle. Reschedule the 2 p.m. with marketing. I want to review the Morgan proposal revisions instead." The day proceeded as most did for Xavier: meetings, decisions, strategy sessions, all executed with the precision and focus that had made him a billionaire before his 30th birthday. But as the afternoon wore on, an unusual restlessness settled over him. At 5:30 p.m., Xavier loosened his tie and leaned back in his ergonomic chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The anniversary of Olivia's betrayal always brought with it a shadow that even his carefully constructed walls couldn't completely block out. His intercom buzzed. "What is it, Kyle?" "Sir, there's a woman here from the Children's Future Foundation. Says she needs to discuss tonight's presentation with you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent." Xavier frowned. "Tell her to email the details. I don't have time." "She says it's urgent, sir. Something about changes to the program that affect your speech." Xavier sighed. "Fine, 5 minutes." He straightened his tie and stood just as the office door opened. The woman who entered was not what he expected. Instead of the typical polished foundation representative in a conservative suit, she wore a simple blue dress that complemented her slender frame. Her honey blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, clear, determined, and the brightest blue he'd ever seen. "Mr. Anderson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Brielle Garrison, Director of Outreach for the Children's Future Foundation. Thank you for seeing me." Xavier shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the absence of the intimidation most people showed in his presence. "Ms. Garrison, I understand there's an issue with tonight's program?" "Yes," she replied, pulling a tablet from her bag. "We've had to rearrange the speaking order due to Senator Williams being delayed. You're now following the video presentation of the children's stories, which means your speech needs to tie into their experiences more directly." Xavier's jaw tightened. "My speech was finalized weeks ago. I understand, Mr. Anderson. That's why I'm here in person to help with the adjustments." Her voice was professional, but warm and completely unintimidated by his obvious annoyance. "I don't need help writing my speeches, Ms. Garrison." She raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't about your writing ability. It's about connecting with our audience. These children's stories are powerful, and your pledge could inspire others to follow suit if you reference them effectively." For a moment, Xavier was speechless. Few people challenged him directly anymore. 5 minutes, he finally said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Brielle sat down, her posture straight but not stiff. "Thank you. I've brought the video that will precede your speech so you can see exactly what you'll be following." As she queued up the video on her tablet, Xavier found himself studying her. There was something refreshingly direct about Brielle Garrison, a quality that seemed at odds with the usual sycophants he dealt with daily. The video showed interviews with children who had benefited from the Foundation's programs, former foster kids now attending college, young cancer survivors pursuing their dreams, teens who had escaped abuse and found new purpose. Their stories were simple, but powerful, told with a raw honesty that even Xavier couldn't dismiss. When it ended, Brielle looked up at him expectantly. "These are the faces behind the numbers, Mr. Anderson. Your current speech discusses the Foundation's financial goals. But what these kids need to hear is that someone like you believes in their potential." Xavier leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Someone like me? A self-made success, someone who overcame obstacles to build something extraordinary." Her blue eyes met his directly. "They need to know that their past doesn't determine their future." Something shifted in Xavier's chest, an uncomfortable recognition. How long had it been since someone had spoken to him, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a person with experiences that might matter to others? "I see your point," he admitted. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Brielle's face brightened with a smile that transformed her features from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "I've drafted some talking points that connect your personal journey to the Foundation's mission. Would you like to see them?" For the next 20 minutes, well beyond the 5 he'd allocated, Xavier found himself engaged in a surprisingly candid conversation about his own background. The challenges of growing up with a single mother, working his way through college, and the early failures before his breakthrough success. "You should include that," Brielle said earnestly when he mentioned the 3 startup attempts that had failed before Anderson Technologies took off. "It's exactly what these kids need to hear, that failure is part of the journey, not the end of it." Xavier checked his watch, surprised at how quickly the time had passed. "I should get ready for tonight." "Of course." Brielle gathered her things, then hesitated. "Thank you for being open to the changes, Mr. Anderson. It will mean more than you know to those children." As she stood to leave, Xavier found himself not wanting the conversation to end. It had been refreshing, no hidden agendas, no fawning over his wealth, just straightforward discussion about something that mattered. "Ms. Garrison?" She turned at the door. "Yes? I'll see you at the gala tonight?" She nodded. "I'll be the one making sure everything runs smoothly." After she left, Xavier sat at his desk for several minutes, contemplating their interaction. There had been something different about Brielle Garrison, a genuineness that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He quickly pushed the thought away. He had a speech to revise, and tonight was about the foundation, not about him noticing a woman for the first time in years. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled with elegant decorations for the Children's Future Foundation Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with delicate floral arrangements, while New York's elite mingled in designer formal wear, sipping champagne and making the strategic social connections that such events facilitated. Xavier arrived precisely at 7, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that accentuated his tall, athletic frame. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his expression composed and confident. He navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting greetings with polite nods while maintaining the careful distance he always kept between himself and others. "Xavier, magnificent event, isn't it?" James appeared at his side, champagne flute in hand. "And look at that, you're actually on time for a social function." "It's for the children, James. I wouldn't miss it." Xavier scanned the room, his eyes unconsciously searching for a particular blonde. James followed his gaze. "Looking for someone?" "Just getting my bearings," Xavier replied smoothly. "How's the turnout?" "Stellar. The foundation might break last year's fundraising record. Speaking of which, have you met the new director of outreach? Incredibly capable woman, and not hard on the eyes, either." Xavier's interest piqued. "Brielle Garrison?" "Yes, she came by the office today." A knowing smile spread across James's face. "Did she now? And here I thought she couldn't get past the impenetrable wall of Kyle says no." "It was foundation business," Xavier said dismissively. Though he found himself continuing to search the crowd, he spotted her across the room, speaking animatedly with an elderly couple. She wore a floor-length gown in deep emerald that complemented her fair skin and made her blue eyes stand out even from a distance. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elegant twist, revealing the graceful line of her neck. As if sensing his gaze, Brielle looked up, met his eyes, and offered a small smile and nod before returning to her conversation. "Earth to Xavier," James said, waving a hand in front of his face. "You're staring." Xavier blinked and frowned at his friend. "I was observing the room." "Right. One particular part of the room that happens to be wearing green." James chuckled. "Well, I'll leave you to your observations. Senator Williams just arrived, and I need to schmooze." Left alone, Xavier made his way to the bar, ordering a Scotch neat. He was taking his first sip when a voice spoke beside him. "Liquid courage for the speech?" Brielle asked, her tone lightly teasing. Xavier turned to find her standing closer than he expected, the subtle scent of her perfume, something floral with hints of vanilla reaching him. "Professional habit," he replied. "One drink at events like these. No more, no less." "Always in control," she observed, but there was no judgment in her voice. "Did you have a chance to review those talking points?" "I did, made some adjustments." "I'm looking forward to hearing them." She accepted a glass of white wine from the bartender. "By the way, I wanted to thank you for your generous contribution this year. Your donation will fund our college scholarship program for 3 full years." Xavier shrugged. "It's a worthwhile cause. Still, not everyone with your resources chooses to give back so substantially." She studied him with those perceptive blue eyes. "What drew you to our foundation specifically?" The question caught him off guard. Most people assumed his philanthropic efforts were just tax write-offs or PR moves. Few asked about his motivations. "My mother," he found himself saying. "She was a single parent, worked 3 jobs sometimes. We never had much, but she always made sure I had opportunities books, science camps when she could afford them, encouragement to aim high." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Not every kid has that. Your foundation gives them a fighting chance." Brielle's expression softened. "That's..." Not what I expected you to say. Because of the Ice King reputation? He asked dryly. A slight blush colored her cheeks. I didn't mean, it's fine. The business press needs their narratives. Xavier surprised himself with a small smile. Though I admit, the ice sculpture they included in the photo spread was a bit much. She laughed, the sound genuine and warm. I think I missed that issue. Count yourself lucky. Xavier found himself relaxing slightly. What about you? How did you end up at the foundation? I was one of those kids, she said simply. Foster care from age 7 to 18. The foundation helped me get into college when I had no family support. Her expression grew more animated as she continued. After graduation, I wanted to help create those same opportunities for others. Started as a volunteer, worked my way up. Xavier felt a newfound respect blooming. So, this isn't just a job for you. No more than your company is just a job for you, she replied. Some things matter more than a paycheck. Their conversation was interrupted by the foundation's president approaching the podium, signaling the start of the formal program. I should get back to work, Brielle said. Good luck with your speech, Mr. Anderson. Xavier, he corrected her, surprising himself again. She smiled. Good luck, Xavier, though I doubt you'll need it. As she walked away, Xavier felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a genuine interest in another person, a desire to continue their conversation. He quickly suppressed the feeling. One pleasant interaction didn't change anything. He had locked away his heart for good reason. And no blue-eyed foundation director with an infectious smile was going to change that. The program proceeded smoothly. Xavier watched Brielle move efficiently around the room, coordinating with staff, checking in with speakers, ensuring everything ran according to plan. When the video of the children's stories played, he observed how she stood at the back of the room, her expression a mixture of pride and profound empathy. This wasn't just professional dedication, this was personal. Then it was his turn to speak. As Xavier took the stage, he set aside his prepared remarks and spoke instead from a place he'd kept carefully guarded for years, his heart. Most of you know me as the CEO of Anderson Technologies, he began. You know the success story, the acquisitions, the stock price. What you may not know is that 30 years ago, I was not so different from the children you just saw in that video. The ballroom fell completely silent as Xavier shared parts of his past that even his closest associates had never heard. The tiny apartment he'd shared with his mother, the scholarship that had changed his trajectory, the failures that had nearly broken him before his eventual success. What these children need isn't just money, he continued, his gaze finding Brielle in the audience. They need to know that someone believes their potential matters more than their circumstances, that their worth isn't measured by what they lack, but by what they can become. By the time he finished, announcing an additional matching gift that would double any donations made that night, the crowd was on their feet. As applause thundered through the ballroom, Xavier caught Brielle's eye. She wasn't clapping, she was standing perfectly still, looking at him with an expression of stunned appreciation, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, a connection that transcended the professional boundaries they had established. And for the first time in 3 years, Xavier felt the walls around his heart tremble, just slightly. The remainder of the gala was a blur of congratulations and conversations with potential donors eager to have their contributions matched. Xavier navigated these interactions with practiced charm, but his awareness of Brielle's presence in the room never dimmed. He would catch glimpses of her across the ballroom, handling last-minute issues with calm efficiency, her smile warm and genuine as she spoke with guests. It was nearly midnight when the crowd finally began to thin. Xavier had just finished a conversation with a tech industry colleague when he spotted Brielle near one of the exits, checking something on her tablet. Without consciously deciding to do so, he found himself walking in her direction. "Ms. Garrison," he said, approaching her. She looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Mr. Anderson, Xavier, I thought you'd left already." "Not yet." He hesitated, suddenly unsure of what he wanted to say. "I wanted to thank you for your input on the speech. It seems to have made an impact." Her smile was radiant. "It was incredible. I've never seen a room respond like that at one of our galas. The initial numbers show we've already exceeded last year's total by 30%. Good, that's good. An awkward silence fell between them. Something Xavier wasn't accustomed to. He was always in control of conversations, always knew exactly what to say in any business situation. But this wasn't business, was it? Well, I should finish up here, Brielle finally said, gesturing to her tablet. Right. Xavier nodded, then surprised himself by asking, Do you need a ride home? My driver's waiting. Brielle hesitated. That's very kind, but I'll be here for at least another hour wrapping things up. The cleanup crew needs direction, and I need to secure the donation records. I can wait, he heard himself offer, then immediately wondered what had possessed him to say it. She studied him for a moment, her blue eyes searching his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Why would you do that? It was a fair question, and one Xavier wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Because it's late, and you've worked hard to make this event a success. Consider it a small thank you for what your foundation does. A small smile played at her lips. All right, thank you. For the next hour, Xavier found himself helping Brielle coordinate the cleanup efforts, something he couldn't remember ever doing at a function before. He spoke with the catering staff, helped secure the silent auction items, and even carried boxes of leftover program materials to her car. It was mundane work, far removed from the high-stakes decisions he made daily. Yet, he found it oddly satisfying. You know, Brielle said as they loaded the last box, most billionaires don't stick around to help with cleanup. Most foundation directors don't march into CEOs' offices and tell them to rewrite their speeches, he countered with a raised eyebrow. She laughed. Touché. I suppose we're both full of surprises. The night air was cool as they finally left the plaza. Xavier's sleek black Bentley waited at the curb, his driver standing at attention beside it. Where to, Ms. Garrison? Xavier asked as the driver opened the door for them. Upper West Side, please. 83rd in Amsterdam. As the car glided through the late-night streets of Manhattan, a comfortable silence settled between them. Xavier was struck by how unusual this felt, not just being in his car with a woman he barely knew, but the strange sense of ease he experienced in her presence. That was really something tonight, Brielle said softly, breaking the silence. What you shared about your childhood. It couldn't have been easy. Xavier looked out at the passing city lights. It wasn't. I don't talk about those years often. Why did you tonight? He turned to meet her gaze, finding genuine curiosity there. Because you were right. Those kids don't need to hear from a successful CEO. They need to hear from someone who understands what it's like to start with nothing. She nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think your mother would be very proud of you, not just for what you've built, but for remembering where you came from. The comment touched something deep within Xavier, a place he'd kept carefully guarded. His mother had passed away just as Anderson Technologies was beginning to take off, never seeing the full extent of his success. Thank you, he said simply. The car pulled up to a pre-war apartment building on Amsterdam Avenue. It was a nice neighborhood, but a far cry from Xavier's penthouse overlooking Central Park. This is me, Brielle said as the driver opened the door. Thank you for the ride and for staying to help. You really didn't have to do that. It was no trouble, Xavier replied, surprising himself by adding, I enjoyed the company. She smiled, a hint of shyness breaking through her professional demeanor. So did I. Xavier found himself reluctant to end the evening. Would you like to get coffee sometime? To discuss the Foundation's upcoming initiatives, of course? Of course, she echoed, her smile widening slightly. For the Foundation, I'd like that. They exchanged phone numbers, and Xavier watched as she entered her building, turning once to wave before disappearing inside. As his car pulled away from the curb, he realized he was smiling, actually smiling, for what felt like the first time in years. The rational part of his brain immediately began listing all the reasons he should cancel that coffee. He didn't have time for distractions. Personal entanglements were messy. He'd sworn off relationships after Olivia. But another part, one that had been dormant for 3 years, whispered that perhaps one coffee wouldn't hurt. Just one coffee, he told himself. Nothing more. Xavier woke the next morning with Brielle Garrison still on his mind. It was disconcerting he'd built his post-Olivia life around predictability and control, around never allowing himself to dwell on anyone who might potentially matter. Yet here he was, wondering when would be an appropriate time to call about that coffee. Get it together. Anderson, he muttered to himself, as he completed his morning workout with more intensity than usual. At the office, he threw himself into work with singular focus, taking back-to-back meetings and reviewing acquisition proposals until his eyes burned. But even in the midst of a particularly contentious negotiation call, he found his thoughts drifting to blue eyes and a genuine smile. By mid-afternoon, Xavier had reached a decision. He would call Brielle, arrange the coffee meeting, satisfy his curiosity about her, and then move on. This unusual preoccupation was simply because she was different from the people he typically encountered, more authentic, more direct. Once he spent a little more time with her, the novelty would wear off, and he could return to his carefully ordered life. He waited until after his last meeting to make the call, telling himself it was because his schedule was packed, not because he felt an unusual flutter of nervousness. She answered on the third ring. "Brielle Garrison." "Ms. Garrison, it's Xavier Anderson." "Xavier," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I was just thinking about you." The admission caught him off guard. "You were?" "Yes. The final donation numbers came in from last night. Your speech and matching offer brought in more than double what we raised last year. Our executive director is practically doing cartwheels down the hallway." Xavier found himself smiling. "I'm glad to hear it. Actually, I was calling about that coffee we discussed. Are you free tomorrow morning?" There was a brief pause before she replied. "I have a meeting with our program directors at 9, but I could do 8 if that's not too early." "8 works. There's a place called Milo's on 58th. Do you know it?" "I do. They make the best almond croissants in the city." "Then I'll see you there at 8. After hanging up, Xavier stared at his phone for a moment. A coffee meeting at 8 a.m. was hardly significant. He had breakfast meetings several times a week. Yet this felt different, and the realization made him uneasy. The next morning, Xavier arrived at Milo's at 7:50 a.m., choosing a quiet table in the back of the cafe. The place was a small, unassuming establishment that he favored precisely because it wasn't frequented by the business crowd who might recognize him. Here, he could occasionally enjoy a coffee without interruption or the need to maintain his CEO persona. He spotted Brielle the moment she walked in. She wore a simple knee-length navy dress with a light cardigan, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She looked professional but approachable and undeniably beautiful in the morning light streaming through the cafe windows. When she saw him, her face brightened with a smile that seemed to illuminate the space between them. Xavier found himself standing as she approached, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. He couldn't recall performing for anyone in recent memory. "Good morning," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all. I just arrived." He gestured to the counter. "What can I get you?" "A latte and one of those famous almond croissants, please." When he returned with their order, he found Brielle looking at a photo on her phone, her expression soft. "Something interesting?" he asked, setting down her coffee. She turned the phone to show him a group of children, ages ranging from about 6 to 16, all beaming at the camera while holding art projects. "Our Saturday art program," she explained. "This was from last weekend. The little girl in the front, Zoe, she's 7 and already incredibly talented. She's been in 5 foster homes in the past 2 years, barely speaks, but when she paints..." Brielle's eyes lit up. It's like she finds her voice. Xavier studied the photo, drawn to the genuine joy on the children's faces. "You work directly with the kids?" "Every chance I get. The administrative work pays the bills, but the real reward is seeing their progress firsthand." As they sipped their coffee, the conversation flowed more easily than Xavier had anticipated. He found himself genuinely interested in Brielle's work with the foundation, the challenges of serving children with traumatic backgrounds, and the small victories that made it worthwhile. "What about you?" she asked, after describing a particularly difficult case that had recently shown improvement. "What's the most rewarding part of what you do?" The question made Xavier pause. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him about the personal satisfaction of his work, rather than its financial success. "Problem solving," he answered honestly. "Finding solutions that others miss. Creating technology that makes a meaningful difference." He hesitated, then added, Though sometimes, in the day-to-day management of a global company, that initial purpose gets buried under shareholder expectations and quarterly goals. Brielle nodded thoughtfully. It's easy to lose sight of the why when you're caught up in the how, isn't it? Exactly. Xavier was struck by how precisely she'd captured his recent dissatisfaction. It's one of the reasons I've been considering a new research division smaller, more focused on innovation than immediate profit. That sounds exciting, she said, leaning forward with genuine interest. What kind of innovation? For the next 20 minutes, Xavier found himself explaining his vision for technology that could help disadvantaged communities, ideas he hadn't shared with anyone, not even his executive team. Brielle asked insightful questions and offered perspectives he hadn't considered, particularly about implementation in underserved areas. You should talk to our education director, she suggested. She used to work in tech and now focuses on bringing STEM programs to schools in low-income neighborhoods. She'd have valuable input on making these tools accessible. I'd like that, Xavier replied, surprised to find he meant it. He glanced at his watch, startled to see it was already 8:45. I believe you have a 9 o'clock meeting? Brielle's eyes widened. I completely lost track of time. I should go. As they gathered their things, Xavier realized he didn't want this to be their only meeting. I enjoyed this, he said as they stepped outside the cafe. Perhaps we could continue the conversation sometime. She looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face again with that perceptive gaze. I'd like that. But Xavier, is this about the foundation, or is this something else? The direct question caught him off guard. Most people in his world operated in carefully constructed layers of politeness and ulterior motives. Brielle's straightforwardness was as refreshing as it was disarming. I'm not entirely sure, he admitted, more honest than he'd intended to be. Would that be a problem? A small smile played at her lips. No, not a problem. Just good to know where we stand. Dinner this weekend then? He asked. Saturday at 7? Saturday at 7, she confirmed. Text me the details. As he watched her hail a taxi, Xavier felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation, mixed with a hint of something that felt dangerously like hope. The rest of the week crawled by with unusual slowness. Xavier found himself checking his phone more often than normal, a behavior he recognized with mild alarm, as reminiscent of his early days with Olivia. But this was different, he told himself. He was older now, wiser. This was just dinner with an interesting woman, nothing more. Still, by Saturday evening, as he prepared for the night ahead, Xavier couldn't deny the nervous energy that had him changing his tie twice before settling on a deep blue one that his housekeeper had once mentioned brought out his eyes. He had chosen Riviera, a small, elegant French restaurant in the West Village known for its excellent food and discreet service. It was upscale without being ostentatious, intimate without being romantic at least. That's what he told himself as he requested a quiet corner table. Brielle arrived precisely at 7. Wearing a simple black dress that accentuated her slender figure without being revealing, her hair was loose around her shoulders, caught by the warm candlelight as she approached his table. Xavier found himself standing again, drawn by some instinct that had nothing to do with his usual calculated courtesy. You look beautiful, he said, the words escaping before he could filter them through his usual restraint. A light blush colored her cheeks. Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself. Over appetizers, they picked up their conversation, where they'd left it at the cafe, discussing ideas for educational technology and how it might be implemented through the Foundation's programs. But as the main course arrived, the discussion naturally shifted to more personal territory. So, Brielle said, taking a sip of her wine, I've done some research on you. Xavier raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? She laughed. Nothing nefarious. Just the usual Google search anyone might do before having dinner with a billionaire. And what did the internet tell you about me? The official story, brilliant tech entrepreneur, ruthless businessman, famously private. She tilted her head slightly. But it doesn't explain why someone with your success seems so... She paused, searching for the right word. Guarded? He supplied. I was going to say lonely. The observation struck closer to home than he was comfortable with. Xavier took a moment before responding. What makes you think I'm lonely? Just an impression. Brielle's gaze was direct but gentle. You're successful, respected, undeniably attractive, yet you attend major functions alone. You're rarely photographed in social settings, and according to several profiles, you work 16-hour days. It seems like a solitary existence for someone who has so much to offer. Xavier found himself at an uncharacteristic loss for words. Most people in his life took his reserved nature at face value, never questioning the careful distance he maintained. "I prefer it that way," he finally said. "Relationships complicate things." "They do," she agreed easily. "But they can also enrich life in ways success and money can't." There was no judgment in her tone, just a simple statement of her perspective. Xavier found himself wanting to explain, to have her understand his reasons. "I was engaged once," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so long keeping that part of his past private. 3 years ago. It ended. Badly." Brielle nodded, her expression attentive but not prying. "I'm sorry to hear that." "She was with my business partner," Xavier continued, surprised at his own willingness to share. "For months, apparently, while we were planning our wedding. I found out when I came home early from a business trip." "That's terrible," Brielle said softly. "A betrayal like that leaves scars." "It taught me a valuable lesson about trust." Xavier's tone hardened slightly. "And about keeping personal and professional lives separate." "Understandable," Brielle replied. "Though I hope you know not everyone is like that." "What about you?" Xavier asked, ready to shift the focus away from himself. "Your turn in the hot seat. Any skeletons in your romantic closet?" She smiled ruefully. "Nothing quite so dramatic. My last relationship ended about a year ago, mutual decision when he got a job offer in Seattle. Before that." She shrugged. "Let's just say growing up in foster care doesn't exactly prepare you for healthy relationships. I've had my share of missteps." "Yet you seem remarkably well adjusted," Xavier observed. "I had good counselors through the foundation," she explained, "and I learned early on that while I couldn't control what happened to me, I could control how I responded to it." Xavier was struck by her resilience, her ability to acknowledge pain without being defined by it. It was a stark contrast to his own approach of walling off anything that threatened his emotional equilibrium. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they enjoyed dessert, a shared chocolate soufflé that Brielle insisted they try, claiming it was life-changing. Xavier found himself relaxing, even laughing at her animated retelling of a foundation fundraiser gone hilariously wrong when a donor's pet iguana escaped during the silent auction. As the evening drew to a close, they stepped out into the cool night air. Without thinking, Xavier placed his hand lightly on the small of her back as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. The simple contact sent an unexpected warmth through him. "I can drop you home," he offered, nodding toward his waiting car. Brielle hesitated. "Actually, it's a beautiful night. Would you mind if we walked for a bit? I'm just a few blocks from here." The request surprised him. Most people were eager to ride in his luxury car, but something about the idea of extending their evening appealed to him. "Lead the way," he said. They strolled through the West Village's charming streets, past brownstones with window boxes and small boutiques closed for the night. Their conversation continued effortlessly, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd traveled, and their shared love of early morning hours when the city was still quiet. "This is me," Brielle said eventually, stopping in front of a well-maintained brownstone. "Thank you for dinner. I had a wonderful time." "So did I," Xavier replied, realizing with some surprise that it was entirely true. They stood facing each other, and for a moment, Xavier considered kissing her. The thought both thrilled and alarmed him. It had been so long since he'd felt this kind of attraction, this pull toward another person. Instead, he took her hand gently. "I'd like to see you again, Brielle." She smiled, her blue eyes reflecting the streetlight above them. "I'd like that too." As Xavier walked back to his car, he felt lighter somehow, as if some of the weight he'd been carrying for 3 years had begun to lift. It was unsettling and exhilarating all at once. "This is dangerous," his rational mind warned. "You're opening yourself up to the very thing you swore to avoid." But for the first time in a very long time, Xavier wasn't sure he wanted to listen to that voice of caution. Over the next few weeks, Xavier found himself seeing Brielle with increasing frequency. What began as dinner became a series of encounters that fit surprisingly well into his otherwise regimented life. Sunday morning walks in Central Park, Tuesday evening takeout in his office when they both worked late. A Saturday at the Met when Brielle mentioned she'd never seen the new modern art exhibition. Each meeting revealed new facets of Brielle that intrigued him further. Her encyclopedic knowledge of obscure historical facts, her terrible but enthusiastic singing voice that she demonstrated when her favorite song came on at a small jazz club he took her to, her fierce advocacy when speaking about the children she worked with. He also found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years, stories from his childhood, the crushing failures that had preceded his success, even his doubts about the direction Anderson Technologies was taking under pressure from the board to prioritize profit over innovation. 3 weeks after their first dinner, they were walking along the High Line after an early evening movie when Brielle asked the question Xavier had been dreading. "Xavier, what exactly are we doing?" He looked at her, taking in her expression open, direct, but with a hint of vulnerability that mirrored his own unspoken feelings. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew perfectly well. She gave him a gentle look that said she wasn't buying his evasion. "We've seen each other almost every day for 3 weeks. We talk for hours. You know more about me than people I've known for years." She paused. "But you haven't even tried to kiss me." Xavier felt his heart rate increase. "I didn't want to presume." "Now you're being diplomatic," she said with a small smile. "The Xavier Anderson I've come to know isn't afraid to go after what he wants. So either you don't want to kiss me, which would make these frequent meetings somewhat confusing, or there's something holding you back." Her directness both challenged and disarmed him. Xavier stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the setting sun casting a golden glow over her features. "I do want to kiss you," he admitted quietly. "I have since that first dinner. But this, whatever this is between us, it wasn't part of my plan." "Life rarely follows our plans," she said, stepping closer to him. "Sometimes that's a good thing." Xavier looked into her eyes, seeing the warmth and understanding there. For 3 years, he had maintained absolute control over every aspect of his life, never allowing himself to be vulnerable, never risking his heart again. But, standing here with Brielle, those carefully constructed walls felt increasingly like a prison rather than protection. "I'm not good at this anymore," he said, his voice low, "letting someone in." "I've noticed," she replied with a gentle smile, "but you're better at it than you think." With that, she rose slightly on her toes and pressed her lips to his, in a kiss so soft it was almost hesitant. Xavier remained still for a heartbeat, absorbing the sensation, the warmth of her lips, the faint scent of her perfume, the feeling of something long dormant awakening within him. Then, as if a dam had broken, he responded, one hand moving to cradle her face while the other wrapped around her waist, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and honest, an admission of everything he'd been trying to deny. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Brielle's eyes were bright with emotion. "See? Not so terrible." Xavier laughed, a genuine sound of surprised joy. "Not terrible at all." They continued their walk hand in hand, the physical connection between them as natural as if they'd been doing it for years instead of minutes. Xavier felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated, like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that stepping forward could lead to either flight or falling. "I should warn you," he said as they reached the end of the High Line. "I'm out of practice at relationships, and I have some trust issues." Brielle squeezed his hand. "I gathered that. And I have my own baggage growing up in the system doesn't exactly foster easy trust either." She looked up at him with those clear blue eyes. "But I think we're both smart enough to learn from past mistakes without letting them dictate our future." "That sounds suspiciously like optimism," Xavier remarked with a raised eyebrow. "Guilty as charged," she replied. "Someone in this relationship has to balance out all that brooding CEO intensity." Relationship? The word hung between them, simultaneously promising and daunting. Xavier knew he should be cautious, should retreat to the safe, emotional distance he'd maintained for so long. But standing there with Brielle, he found himself unwilling to step back. "So," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "what happens now?" Now, she said with a smile, you kiss me again, and then maybe we figure out the rest as we go. So we did, right there on the High Line, with the New York City skyline as their backdrop, not caring who might see the normally reserved CEO of Anderson Technologies openly displaying affection. In that moment, Xavier Anderson, who had sworn to forget love forever, found himself taking the first tentative steps back toward it. As spring gave way to summer, Xavier and Brielle's relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. For Xavier, who had structured his post, Olivia Life, around predictability and emotional distance, allowing Brielle into his world meant dismantling barriers he'd spent years constructing. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when old fears surfaced when Brielle had to cancel plans unexpectedly due to a foundation emergency. His mind immediately conjured images of Olivia's excuses that had masked her betrayal. When business associates commented on his relationship with a woman who wasn't from their wealthy circle, he questioned whether their different backgrounds would eventually create an unbridgeable gap. Yet, Brielle met his doubts with patience and her characteristic directness. When he grew distant after seeing her talking animatedly with his CFO at a company function, she confronted him immediately. "You've been quiet all evening," she said as they rode back to his penthouse. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, just tired." The automatic deflection came easily. Brielle gave him a look that clearly communicated her disbelief. "Xavier, I've seen you function perfectly well on 2 hours of sleep during a crisis. Try again." He sighed, knowing her persistence would outlast his evasion. "I saw you with James earlier. You seemed very engaged in conversation." Understanding dawned on her face. "You're jealous." "I'm cautious," he corrected, though the distinction felt hollow even to him. "Because your ex cheated with your business partner," she stated plainly, "and you're worried history might repeat itself." Put so bluntly, his fears seemed almost absurd, yet they had felt so real. "It's not personal, it's just—" "It is personal," Brielle interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "To me, because it means you don't trust me." The hurt in her eyes cut through Xavier's defenses. He took her hand, forcing himself to be as honest as she always was with him. "I'm trying, Brielle. Trust doesn't come easily to me anymore." "I know," she said, squeezing his hand. "But relationships only work when we judge each other by our own actions, not by the wounds inflicted by others." She met his gaze directly. "I need you to see me, Xavier, not the shadow of someone who hurt you." Her words resonated deeply, highlighting how much of his life had been lived in reaction to Olivia's betrayal rather than in pursuit of new possibilities. That night, as they lay together in his bed, Xavier made a silent promise to try harder, to see Brielle for who she was not, who he feared she might be. It was a turning point. In the weeks that followed, Xavier found himself gradually releasing his grip on old fears, allowing himself to enjoy the relationship without constant vigilance for signs of betrayal. And, as he opened up, he discovered aspects of himself he'd forgotten, existed the capacity for spontaneous joy, for unguarded laughter, for making someone else's happiness a priority alongside his own ambitions. One particularly telling moment came when Brielle mentioned needing to spend her Saturday supervising a foundation's field trip to the Museum of Natural History. Without hesitation, Xavier offered to join her. "You want to spend your Saturday with 20 foster kids running around a museum?" she asked, clearly surprised. "I want to spend my Saturday with you," he replied honestly. "The 20 kids are just a bonus." The day proved to be unexpectedly rewarding. Xavier found himself drawn to a quiet 10-year-old boy named Marcus, who showed remarkable interest in the technology exhibits. By the end of the trip, Xavier had promised to arrange a special tour of Anderson Technologies for Marcus and any other interested kids from the program. "You were amazing with them," Brielle said later as they walked back to his apartment, "especially Marcus." Xavier smiled, remembering the boy's excited questions. "He reminds me of myself at that age. Curious about everything, trying to understand how things work." "You should see his file," Brielle said softly. 3 foster homes in 2 years, parents lost to addiction. Yet he maintains straight A's and has never had a behavioral issue. "He's resilient," Xavier observed, "like someone else I know." Brielle leaned into him as they walked. "It meant a lot to him that you took him seriously. that you didn't talk down to him. Children know when adults are being patronizing. I hated it when I was his age." He paused, then added, "I've been thinking about setting up a mentorship program through the company, matching kids like Marcus with engineers and developers who could nurture their interests." Brielle looked up at him with an expression of such warmth that Xavier felt something shift inside him, another piece of his carefully guarded heart yielding to her influence. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, smiling. "I just love seeing this side of you." The word hung between them, love not directly applied to him, but close enough to send a ripple of both alarm and longing through his chest. Neither of them had used that word yet, though after nearly 3 months together, Xavier was beginning to acknowledge to himself what his feelings for Brielle had become. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in his rarely used kitchen, another change Brielle had brought to his life, actual cooking, instead of takeout or chef-prepared meals. Xavier watched her move around the space with comfortable familiarity. She'd become a regular presence in his home, with a toothbrush in his bathroom and a drawer of her clothes in his bedroom. The domestic intimacy of it should have triggered his instinct for self-preservation, but instead, he found himself wanting more of it. "Move in with me," he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. Brielle paused in the act of chopping vegetables, her eyes widening. "What? Move in with me?" Xavier repeated, more certain now. "You're here most nights anyway. Your lease is up next month. It makes sense." She put down the knife, studying him with that perceptive gaze that always seemed to see right through him. "Does it make sense, or does it feel right? There's a difference." Xavier moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Both. It makes practical sense, and it feels right." He hesitated, then added the truth that lay beneath his practical reasoning. "I want to come home to you every day, Brielle. I want to build a life with you." The joy that spread across her face told him everything he needed to know before she even spoke. "Yes," she said simply, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Yes, I'll move in with you." That night, as Brielle slept beside him, Xavier lay awake, marveling at how dramatically his life had changed in just a few months. The man who had sworn to forget love, who had built walls specifically designed to keep it out, now found himself willingly, even eagerly, embracing it. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The transition of Brielle moving into Xavier's penthouse happened gradually over the following weeks. Each day, a few more of her belongings appeared, colorful throw pillows that softened his minimalist furniture, framed photographs of landscapes she'd taken during her travels, shelves of well-worn books that joined his pristine collection. "Your place is starting to look lived in," James commented during a rare social visit. "I hardly recognize it." Xavier glanced around at the subtle changes. "Is that a criticism?" "Just the opposite," James replied, genuine approval in his voice. "It's good to see you building a real life, Xav. You've been running on autopilot for too long." It was true, Xavier realized. Before Brielle, his home had been little more than a place to sleep between workdays, functional, luxurious, but ultimately empty of personal meaning. Now, it felt like exactly what it was supposed to be, a home. The changes weren't limited to his living space. At work, colleagues noticed a shift in his management style, still demanding excellence, but with a new willingness to consider work-life balance for his team. The research division he'd mentioned to Brielle during their first coffee was now in development, with a focus on educational technology for underserved communities. He'd even started leaving the office at reasonable hours most days, prioritizing evenings with Brielle over the punishing work schedule that had previously defined his life. Not everyone approved of these changes. At a board meeting in late summer, Xavier faced pushback on his new initiatives. "These philanthropic projects are all very admirable," said Richard Westfield, one of the more conservative board members. "But they're a significant departure from our core business model. Some shareholders are expressing concern about the direction you're taking the company." Xavier met the older man's gaze steadily. "The educational technology division has the potential to open entirely new markets while making a positive social impact. It's not charity, it's strategic growth with purpose. And this sudden interest in social impact wouldn't have anything to do with your new relationship?" another board member asked with thinly veiled skepticism. Ms. Garrison's influence has been rather notable. The implication that Xavier's judgment was clouded by his personal relationship struck a nerve. 3 months ago, such an insinuation might have triggered a defensive reaction, a retreat to the emotional isolation that had characterized his post-Olivia life. Now, it only strengthened his resolve. "My personal life is not up for board discussion," he replied coolly. "But to address your concern, yes, Brielle has helped me see opportunities I might have overlooked. That's what good partners do. They broaden our perspective." He leaned forward. "The proposals before you are sound business decisions that happen to align with personal values I've always held, but perhaps lost sight of for a time." The meeting eventually ended with tentative approval for his plans, but Xavier knew the skepticism remained. On the drive home, he found himself reflecting on how completely his priorities had shifted. 6 months ago, gaining the board's unqualified approval would have been paramount. Now, it seemed far less important than staying true to the vision he and Brielle had discussed over countless conversations. When he arrived home, he found Brielle in what had become her favorite spot, curled up in the window seat overlooking the park, laptop open as she reviewed foundation documents. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting with the smile that still made his heart race. "How was the board meeting?" she asked, setting aside her work. "Mixed," he admitted, loosening his tie as he joined her. "They approved the educational tech division, but not without implying you've compromised my business judgment." Brielle raised her eyebrows. "Should I be flattered or offended?" "Neither," Xavier said, pulling her close. "They're wrong. You haven't changed my values, you've reminded me of what they always were." She studied his face, her expression softening. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." Later that evening, as they shared dinner on the terrace, Xavier found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to for years. Before Brielle, he had lived entirely in the present, avoiding thoughts of tomorrow because they had seemed pointless without someone to share them with. Now, he found himself making plans that extended months, even years ahead. Vacations they could take, holidays they would share, the life they were building together. "What are you thinking about?" Brielle asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "You've been quiet." Xavier took her hand across the table. "Us, the future." "And what does that future look like?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. He hesitated, not out of doubt, but from the magnitude of what he wanted to say. "It looks like everything I stopped believing was possible after Olivia, a partnership, a family eventually, a life that matters beyond business success." Brielle's eyes glistened in the candlelight. "That sounds like a good future." "It does," Xavier agreed. "But there's something I need to say first, something I should have said weeks ago." He took a deep breath, confronting the last of his fears. For so long, these 3 words had represented his greatest vulnerability, the declaration that had preceded his greatest pain. Yet now, they felt like the most natural truth he knew. "I love you, Brielle," he said simply. "I tried not to. I thought I'd forgotten how. But here we are." She reached across the table, cupping his face gently. "I love you too, Xavier. I have for a while now." The admission created a warmth in his chest that spread throughout his body. For 3 years, Xavier had believed that closing himself off from love was the only way to protect himself from pain. Now he understood that in doing so, he had also closed himself off from the very thing that made life worth living. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Xavier made a silent promise not to guard his heart, but to offer it fully with all the risk and reward that entailed. The man who had wanted to forget love for good now found himself grateful beyond measure that it had found him again that day in his office when a determined foundation director had refused to take no for an answer. As autumn painted Central Park in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier found himself planning something he'd sworn would never happen again. A proposal. The decision hadn't come as a sudden revelation, but as the natural progression of a relationship that had transformed his life over the past 6 months. "You're distracted today," James noted as they left a meeting with potential investors. "Everything okay with you and Brielle?" "Everything's fine," Xavier replied, then hesitated before adding, "Actually, I could use your help with something. James raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. The great Xavier Anderson needs my help? This I have to hear. In his office with the door closed, Xavier revealed his plan. I'm going to ask Brielle to marry me. James's face broke into a genuine smile. It's about time. When are you thinking? Next weekend. There's a charity event for the foundation at the Botanical Garden. I thought I'd do it there. It would mean something to her, having it connected to the work she cares about. Public proposal? That doesn't sound like you. Xavier shook his head. Not public exactly. I've arranged for a private moment in the Rose Garden after the main event. But I need you to help coordinate with the foundation staff without Brielle finding out. Consider it done, James said, then added more seriously. I'm happy for you, Xav. After what happened with Olivia, I wasn't sure you'd ever take this step again. Neither was I, Xavier admitted. But Brielle, she's different. She never tried to be part of my world for what it could give her. She invited me into hers instead. The week leading up to the proposal was a study in careful planning and barely contained nervous energy. Xavier, who could negotiate multi-billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, found himself unexpectedly anxious about asking this one crucial question. He'd selected a ring that reflected Brielle's taste, not the ostentatious diamond that might impress his social circle, but an elegant emerald surrounded by small diamonds, reminiscent of the green dress she'd worn to the gala where they'd first connected. It was distinctive, meaningful, and as unique as she was. The night of the charity event arrived, clear and cool with the scent of autumn in the air. The New York Botanical Garden had been transformed for the occasion, with soft lighting illuminating the pathways and elegant decorations enhancing the natural beauty of the setting. Brielle was in her element, moving among donors and foundation children alike with genuine warmth. She wore a simple but stunning navy gown that complemented her blue eyes, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant style that revealed the graceful curve of her neck. Xavier found himself watching her from across the room, still struck by how fortunate he was to have found her. Everything's set, James murmured as he passed by. The garden will be cleared at 9:30, and the staff know to direct you both to the Rose Pavilion. Xavier nodded, patting his pocket for the 10th time to ensure the ring box was still there. Thanks, James. As 9:30 approached, Xavier made his way to Brielle's side, slipping his arm around her waist as she finished a conversation with a donor. You're doing amazing work tonight, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. I think we've exceeded the fundraising goal already. She beamed up at him. It's going better than I could have hoped, and having you here makes all the difference. Speaking of which, Xavier said casually, there's something in the Rose Garden I'd like to show you. A potential installation for next year's event. Brielle looked curious, but didn't question him as he led her along the illuminated path to the Rose Pavilion. As they approached, she gasped softly. The garden had been transformed with hundreds of tiny lights woven through the rose trellises, creating a canopy of stars above the blooms. In the center stood a small table with champagne and 2 glasses. Xavier, what is this? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. He took both her hands in his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a young man pitching his first business idea. 6 months ago, I was convinced that love wasn't worth the risk, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I had built walls around myself that I thought were impenetrable. Then you walked into my office, challenged me to be better, and somehow found your way through every defense I had constructed. Brielle's eyes widened as understanding dawned on her face. You showed me that the man I was before the betrayal, the one who believed in connection, in making a difference, in sharing his life, was still there, just waiting for the right person to remind him what mattered. Xavier took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Brielle Garrison, you made me remember how to love when I thought I'd forgotten for good. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears spilled down Brielle's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, Xavier, I'll marry you. With hands that trembled slightly, Xavier slipped the emerald ring onto her finger, then stood to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. It's perfect, she whispered, looking down at the ring. How did you know? I pay attention, he said simply. And I had some help from your friend Megan at the foundation. She confirmed my suspicion that you prefer colored stones to traditional diamonds." Brielle laughed through her tears. "So, that's why she's been asking such odd questions about jewelry lately." As they sipped champagne in their private garden of lights, Xavier felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for most of his adult life. For years, he had equated success with acquisition: more money, more market share, more power. Now he understood that true success was measured differently by love given and received, by meaningful connection, by the courage to risk one's heart again after devastation. "What are you thinking?" Brielle asked, her head resting against his shoulder as they sat together on a garden bench. "That I'm the luckiest man in New York," he replied honestly, "and that I can't wait to call you my wife." The wedding planning process revealed yet another difference between Xavier's relationship with Brielle and his previous engagement. Where Olivia had insisted on a lavish society affair designed to impress, Brielle advocated for something more intimate and meaningful. "I don't need a wedding that makes the society pages," she told him as they discussed options. "I just want a day that celebrates us, surrounded by people who genuinely care about our happiness." They settled on a spring ceremony at a small estate in the Hudson Valley, with a guest list limited to close friends and family, which, for Brielle, included several of the older children from the foundation who had become like family to her over the years. "Are you sure about inviting Marcus?" Xavier asked when she included the quiet boy they had met at the museum. "It's not exactly a child-friendly event." Brielle's expression grew serious. "Marcus has never attended a family celebration of any kind. No birthdays, no holidays, nothing. When I mentioned our engagement, do you know what he asked me? If he'd still see me after I was married." She took Xavier's hand. "These kids are my family, Xavier. The only one I've had since I was 7. Xavier pulled her close, once again humbled by her capacity for caring. "Then they're my family too. Marcus is definitely invited, and I'll make sure he has a new suit for the occasion." The months leading up to the wedding brought their share of challenges. Xavier's mother had passed years ago, and his father had never been in the picture, leaving him with no blood family to participate. Brielle's situation was even more complex. Her parents' rights had been terminated when she was young, and she had no contact information for them, even if she'd wanted to invite them. "Does it bother you?" Xavier asked one evening as they reviewed the seating chart for the reception. "Not having family at our wedding?" Brielle considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have a father walk me down the aisle or a mother help me choose my dress. But then I remember that family isn't just about blood." She gestured to the chart, which included names of her colleagues from the foundation, children she had mentored, and friends who had supported her journey. "These people have been more family to me than my biological parents ever were." Xavier nodded, understanding completely. His own support system, James, his executive team, even Mrs. Patel, who had been his housekeeper for a decade, had become the closest thing to family he had. "Still," he said thoughtfully, "I'd like us to have someone special stand with each of us. James will be my best man, of course. Who would you want as your maid of honor?" Brielle smiled. "Megan from the foundation. She's been my rock through everything." As the wedding date approached, Xavier found himself increasingly reflective about the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 years ago, devastated by Olivia's betrayal, he had convinced himself that closing off his heart was the only way to protect it. Now, standing on the threshold of marriage to Brielle, he recognized that decision for what it had been: not wisdom, but fear. The evening before their wedding, they broke with tradition and spent the night together in a suite at the estate where they would be married. Lying beside Brielle as she slept peacefully, Xavier found himself overwhelmed with gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her into his office that day, determined to change his speech and, unknowingly, his life. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with spring flowers in full bloom across the estate grounds. Xavier stood at the window of his dressing room, watching guests arrive and take their seats in the garden where the ceremony would be held. A knock at the door revealed James, already dressed in his best man's attire. "Ready for this?" Xavier adjusted his tie, a calm certainty settling over him. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." "No cold feet? No last-minute billionaire escape plan?" James teased. "Not a chance," Xavier replied with absolute conviction. She's the best decision I've ever made. James clapped him on the shoulder. Good, because I brought you something. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Your mother gave this to me before she passed. Asked me to give it to you on your wedding day when you found the right woman. Xavier opened the box to find his father's wedding band, the only thing his mother had kept after the man abandoned them. She had always told Xavier that, despite everything, his father had loved her once, and the ring was a reminder that love, even imperfect love, had value. I had it resized, James added. Thought you might want to use it today. Xavier was momentarily speechless, touched by his friend's thoughtfulness and the connection to his mother on this important day. Thank you, he finally managed. This means everything. Across the estate, Brielle was putting the finishing touches on her appearance with Megan's help. She had chosen a simple but elegant gown that flowed around her like water, her hair styled with small white flowers woven through the loose curls. You look absolutely beautiful, Megan said, adjusting the small crystal hairpins. Xavier is going to be speechless. Brielle smiled, a mixture of excitement and serene happiness settling over her. I still can't quite believe this is happening. A year ago, I was so focused on my career, convinced that my background made lasting relationships too complicated. She touched the emerald ring on her finger. And now here I am, about to marry a man who sees all of me past and present and loves me anyway. Not anyway, Megan corrected gently. Because of who you are, not despite it. That's the difference. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. When Megan opened it, Marcus stood there, looking uncomfortable but determined in his new suit. Ms. Brielle, he said hesitantly. Can I talk to you for a minute? Megan slipped out, leaving Brielle and the boy alone. Marcus approached slowly, clearly awestruck by her appearance. You look like a princess, he said, then immediately looked embarrassed by the childish observation. Brielle smiled warmly. Thank you, Marcus. That's a lovely compliment. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then thrust out a small, clumsily wrapped package. I made this, for your wedding. Mr. Xavier helped me with some of it. Touched, Brielle carefully unwrapped the gift to find a handcrafted photo frame containing a picture of her with a group of foundation children, including Marcus. Around the frame, painted in careful letters, were the words, Family isn't about who you're born to, but who you belong with. Tears welled in Brielle's eyes. Marcus, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received. Mr. Xavier said you were sad about not having family here, the boy explained. But he said we're your family now, him and me and all the other kids. He hesitated, then added quietly, and he asked me to tell you he's waiting whenever you're ready. No rush. The simple message, delivered by this solemn child who had found his own place in their unconventional family, filled Brielle's heart to overflowing. She carefully set the frame aside and knelt to embrace Marcus. Thank you for being part of our special day, she whispered. It wouldn't be the same without you. The ceremony itself was everything they had hoped for, intimate, meaningful, and deeply personal. Instead of being given away, Brielle walked the garden path alone, a symbol of the independent spirit that had first captured Xavier's attention. When she reached him, the look of absolute love and admiration in his eyes told her everything she needed to know about the rightness of their union. They had written their own vows, each promising not perfection, but honest effort, not blind devotion, but clear-eyed commitment. When Xavier slipped his father's band onto her finger alongside her engagement ring, he explained its significance in a voice just loud enough for her to hear. This ring represents the truth that love, even when imperfect, has value, he said, and ours, while not without challenges, is the most valuable thing in my life. The reception that followed was a joyful celebration that blended their two worlds. Children from the foundation mingled with tech executives, foundation staff chatted with Xavier's business associates, all united in their genuine happiness for the couple. As evening fell and the dancing began, Xavier pulled his bride close for their first dance. Happy, Mrs. Anderson? He murmured against her ear. Completely, she replied, her blue eyes shining with joy. Though I'm still getting used to the name. We could have hyphenated, he teased, knowing they'd already had this discussion. Garrison Anderson? Too many syllables, she laughed. Besides, I like the symmetry of it. New name, new chapter. As they moved together to the music, Xavier reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From the guarded CEO determined to forget love to the man who now held his heart in the hands of the woman before him, it had been a transformation he could never have anticipated. "What are you thinking about?" Brielle asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "About that day you came to my office," he replied honestly. "How close I came to having Kyle turn you away. How different my life would be if he had." She smiled, that same direct, genuine smile that had first begun to thaw his frozen heart. "I would have found another way in. I can be quite persistent when something matters." "Thank God for that," Xavier said, pulling her closer. "Because you matter more than anything." Later that night, as their guests continued to celebrate, Xavier and Brielle slipped away to the garden where they had exchanged their vows. Under a canopy of stars, he held her close, marveling at how completely his life had changed in just 1 year. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A wedding gift." He handed her a small velvet pouch. Inside, Brielle found a delicate gold key attached to a slender chain. "It's beautiful," she said, examining it. "But what does it open?" Xavier smiled. "The future. I've established a foundation of our own, the New Beginnings initiative. It will provide housing, education, and support for aging out foster youth." He took her hands. "You'll be the executive director if you want the position. Complete autonomy to build it as you see fit." Brielle's eyes widened in astonishment. "Xavier, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help these kids build the lives they deserve," he said softly. "Say you'll let me support the work that matters most to you." Tears glistened in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes. Of course. Yes." As he fastened the necklace around her throat, Xavier reflected on how thoroughly love had transformed him. The man who had wanted to forget love for good now found himself building his entire future around it, not just with Brielle, but extended to the children whose lives they could change together. "I love you, Brielle Anderson," he said, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "Thank you for not giving up on me that day." "I love you too," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. "And I never will." Under the spring stars, Xavier Anderson, Billionaire CEO, once determined to lock away his heart, forever embraced the greatest risk and greatest reward of his life, a love he had never expected to find again, but which had found him anyway on a seemingly ordinary day that had changed everything.